Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. The founders were wise enough that they made the freedom of the press first among equals as a constitutional guarantee. They also even understood fake news in the form of the pamphleteers of the day. But they never could have imagined bots and trolls and social media as a way for that fake news to be disseminated at light speed. We've seen how lies break from the gate quickly, and the truth can seldom catch up. So for those that aren't monitoring the news 24/7, and for the vast majority of the country that has neither the time or resources to fact-check each story or each new online site, how are we to determine, as Stephen Colbert would say, the truthiness of stories? We've seen lately that algorithms alone simply don't work. So how can the human element be brought in a way that is informative and yet not intrusive, in a process that allows for advocacy, opinion, and human bias, but still respects facts and expertise? The answer, in the opinion of my guest, Stephen Brill, is NewsGuard. Stephen Brill is the founder of American Lawyer, Court TV, Brill's Content, and the Yale Journalism Initiative. He recently co-founded NewsGuard, and he joins me now to tell us more about it. Stephen Brill, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, happy to do it.
Delight to have you here. Tell us a little bit, first of all, about how NewsGuard got started and a little bit about the concept behind it and a little how it evolved.
Well, my partner Gordon Krovitz and I had successfully started and then sold another business a few years ago that was also dedicated to the idea that journalism and the model for journalism needs some new thinking. So we had created a service by which newspapers could get their online readers using what's called a meter to subscribe to the online version. And as you know, that has now has permeated much of the newspaper world and is doing a little bit, and in some cases a lot, to preserve the economic model that newspapers have always had. After we sold that, I went on to work on a book which was just published, which you and I discussed recently. We were thinking, okay, what's another business that journalism needs? And that's when the fake news problem, was becoming really obvious. And what we decided was that sometimes human intelligence is better than artificial intelligence. Just every once in a while, human beings can do something better than a machine. And what human beings can do better than a machine is figure out what's fake news and what's real news. You can use artificial intelligence to weed out hate speech or X-rated sites because you can program artificial intelligence to capture that stuff. But fake news, the whole idea of fake news, is that it looks and feels and reads and seems like real news, only it's fake. So what we have organized with NewsGuard, we've raised money and we've hired several dozen real journalists, who are trained as journalists. And what we are doing is we are reading and rating and reviewing the 5,000 websites in the United States responsible for 98% of the news and information that is consumed online. Now, the ratings are going to be, very simple, common sense, and most of the sites will get a green, but probably 5 to 10% of them will get a red. And when you scroll over the green, you will be able to read what we call a nutrition label, which is a 300 or 400 word description of the site that basically answers the question, who are these people? What are their standards? What are their backgrounds? Who's financing them? And that way you can tell the difference between the Denver Post, which is a real newspaper, and the Denver Guardian, which was a phony website that went online just before the election in 2016. We will be completely transparent about the process. The names of the analysts who we've hired, who've written the nutrition labels and made the rating, will be revealed. Their backgrounds will be revealed. If anybody complains, the complaints will be shown. It's a totally transparent process. We have no axe to grind in terms of right or left or Democrat or Republican. We're evenly balanced, if that matters, between the political leanings of who our analysts are. But what we're looking for is equipping people to understand the sources of the news that they're reading. And the economic model is that the social media platforms, the search engines, will license that data so that when you do a Google search, if you want it, you can have the red and green icons appear next to all the items that pop up in a search, and you'll scroll over that and you'll see, what's behind the green, what's the nutrition label, or what's behind the red, what's that nutrition label. And it's all based on 9, completely objective criteria that we apply to everything that we review.
One of the things that we should point out that the goal of this is not to weed out opinion journalism, not to weed out the Nation or National Review, or to judge in that regard. Talk a little bit about that, because that is a concern some would have.
Yeah, the Nation and National Review; those are two good examples. They're both, they're both likely to get a green rating. In fact, they will, because these are legitimate news organizations. However, they do come at things from completely different points of view, and we will explain that. Typically, for example, the nutrition label for the National Review will quote the fabulously written mission statement that Bill Buckley did when he founded the magazine in the 1950s, where he plainly stated, our mission is to present, news and opinion from the conservative point of view. The Nation magazine will have the same kind of description, and we'll quote their mission statement. We're not here to say that, conservative views are not legitimate, or liberal views are not legitimate, or for that matter, any opinion is not legitimate. Everything just has to be, the straight news. But we will describe the missions of, various news sites. The mission of the Boston Globe is obviously different from the mission of the National Review. It doesn't mean that one is better than the other, or that one deserves a red and one deserves a green. What does deserve a red is the Denver Guardian, which is fake. What does deserve a red is a website, for example, that purports to describe the pros and cons of fracking, but that is secretly financed by the American Petroleum Association.
The other part of this is that it is not set out to fact-check individual articles, that it is much more of an overview of these publications.
Right. That's the key to having scale. If there are, various, relatively small fact-checking organizations that do engage in fact-checking of, various controversial articles. We will draw on what they do, because if one of those organizations has declared that, XYZ website, has published, fake news in the past, we will cite that, we will credit them. However, our own reporters will recheck that to make sure that it's true. But we will draw on that. But, these organizations, they can do a half dozen or a dozen, controversial articles a month, and by the time they're finished doing it, the article may have already, spread around, in the first 8 hours or 12 hours, and, the damage will have been done. We will have a SWAT team on a 24/7 basis that will get alerts, so they will see any website that is suddenly trending, perhaps because they were launched at 4:30 in the morning from Macedonia to report that the Pope has decided to endorse Mr. Trump, and we will wrestle that to the ground within an hour.
How will this work with respect to so many aggregators out there that are bringing in information from so many sources?
Well, for example, if there's an aggregator that is bringing in, as you say, information from many sources, then arguably your Facebook news feed is an aggregator of sorts. A search engine is an aggregator, but there are others, such as Medium. You will see our icons and our ratings alongside any URL that has been aggregated anywhere, as long as we've been able to get NewsGuard licensed by either by the aggregator, who will pay us for it, or we are going to offer a free version that you can plug into your laptop or your desktop, and therefore you'll be able to do it yourself even if that aggregator hasn't licensed us.
I was thinking of something like Drudge and how it would work, for example, with that.
I don't know, actually. I mean, I've been thinking about that. We've been thinking about that. But, Drudge itself, if it's a pure aggregator, then Drudge itself won't get a rating because it's not producing its own content. It used to produce some of its own content, but it really, as best I can tell, I don't think it does anymore. But there are combinations. For example, the Huffington Post produces lots of its own content, but also aggregates content from elsewhere. So the stuff it aggregates will have an icon that's either green or red, and the Huffington Post itself will arguably have an icon that's either green or red.
Talk a little bit about the criteria that you mentioned before, the 8 or 9 standards that really are the underlying basis of the determinations.
Well, they range from the most important ones. Does it gather and publish its content responsibly? And the way we define that, and you can click through and get the definition, the very precise definition, is do they use sources that they name? Do they distort headlines? Do the headlines not meet what the article says? So that's a pretty important one. The others that are less important but still count are, do you have a corrections policy on the website that is readily accessible, and do you make those corrections? Now, you're not going to get a red if you don't do that, but you'll get an X and a red mark, which will be visible and explained on the nutrition label.
Talk a little bit about fake news itself. As you mentioned before, it's become an epidemic, and there are constantly new ways that companies, that individuals are finding to get this out there. Is this going to be, on the part of NewsGuard, kind of an ongoing effort, an eternal vigilance kind of thing to prevent that?
There are all kinds of new things. For example, what we've discovered as the midterms approach is there are some political campaigns that have mounted their own websites that purport to be news websites. The California Telegraph or something, that's actually owned and operated by someone who's running in the election as a candidate, and those things will do articles that that slam the candidate's opponent or praise the candidate, and they're not revealing who they are and who's behind it. One of the bedrock of what we're doing, and in terms of the criteria we use, is do you reveal your financing if your financing is relevant to the information that you're purporting to provide. So, for example, if candidate A is financing a website that does nothing but attack candidate B, but it only just looks like a news website, and it doesn't say this is the website of candidate A, that's going to get a red.
Talk a little bit about social media itself and how NewsGuard will work with social media, both in terms of the business model and in terms of the practical application.
Well, in terms of the practical application, we've seen academic studies and that say that if this is done responsibly, and if people know that the entity like us that is rating these sites is an entity of diverse, well-trained journalists who are qualified to do this, that they will be much less inclined to share an article that has a red icon next to it. Even if they're highly partisan, it will still undercut the confidence they have and their willingness to share that article and therefore to spread the fake news. By the same token, they're much more inclined to share an article that has a green icon because they can rest assured, especially once they read the nutrition label, that they're sharing something that comes from a legitimate news source.
Talk a little bit about what you have heard thus far from people in the news business, from legitimate news sources, and how they're looking upon this, what they feel good about, and what maybe concerns them.
Well, they were initially concerned, and they are concerned, that some of the big platforms like Facebook, for example, were going to try to use algorithms or some wisdom of the crowd surveys to rate the reliability of news sources, which would affect the algorithms and therefore affect how widely shared those news sources are. And there's a big problem with making this a popularity contest. Conversely, they really like our approach because they feel confident, as they should, that if trained journalists are actually applying common sense and good standards, that legitimate news brands will end up much better off. And so we have enormous support from the industry that is out there trying to make a living creating legitimate news. So that's an area where initially there was some concern that we were just going to be fact-checking individual articles, and therefore how could we ever do it? But when they see what our approach is, which is we're just rating the basic legitimacy of news sources, they feel pretty good about that. Mm-hmm. And the downside of that is that we're not solving all the problems of the world. It is highly likely that a newspaper or a .com that has a green rating, will publish something that is not accurate. That happens all the time, and we're not solving for that problem. Mm-hmm. What we are solving for is the problem of, as a general matter, is this a reliable source, and based on the criteria, how reliable is it? That we are solving for.
Is there any room for bringing algorithms into your process, combining it with the human element in some way?
Well, we are going to use artificial intelligence in one way, which is if we give a fake news site a red icon, it is highly likely that they will simply take the same content and start a news site, mm-hmm. or 100 news sites that have the same content. And, so they will try to play whack-a-mole with us. So one way we will use artificial intelligence is that if the same content and the same stories that we have rated red appear on a new site, we will get alerted to that and be able to pin the red rating on the new site too.
And tell us where NewsGuard stands right now. When will it be fully live, etc.?
We will have a version of the browser plugin available for free to consumers, which we're going to distribute through library systems and news literacy groups. So that should happen sometime in the next 4 to 6 weeks. The first time you'll see it on any a search engine or social media platform will probably be sometime before the midterms, or just about when the midterms happen.
Stephen Brill, the site is NewsGuard. Stephen, I thank you so much for spending time with us and giving us a heads up on this exciting new project.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.